Since Elon Musk has acquired Twitter and argued that free speech would be determined in accordance with local governmental laws, I have decided to share a sensible, pragmatic proposition towards a policy approach of free speech that I would like to adopt if society was run by people like myself. To start off, I'll say it straight away, I'm not a free speech absolutist, while at the same time I will say that we ought to strive towards widening the scope of what's allowed to be said, while also applying the same standards of speech restriction without discriminating any group of people and making it less culturally loaded as possible, because the end goal is just a society with no arbitrary political censorship. Now that said, let's get into the particularities of how to go about it and of course explore some of the giants of thought before that. Perhaps the earliest idea behind freedom of speech, which became ingrained into the popular imagination, dates back to John Stuart Mill's work on liberty that I'm sure many of you have read, especially if you have grown up in America or went to college, and it lays down the foundational aspects of how I bet most of you are looking at freedom of speech even today. It views the political landscape as the marketplace of ideas, and the rationale for allowing any ideas to be expressed is the maximization of truth, because if you censor an idea, well, what if what you currently believe is incorrect, but the person who you have censored is correct? Thereby, by having more people to express their ideas freely, you will then maximize the chances you will get the right idea, assuming whichever is the correct one will win the battle of ideas and the truth will be consequently maximized. Now, John Stuart Mill was no free speech absolutist, as frankly some of the right claim he is, but no other major thinkers were, and his idea of where freedom ends is basically when someone's feelings begin, if it was to be reinterpreted using modern standards. Basing it on the harm principle and cultural beliefs, to quote Mill on page 90 in his famous On Liberty, he writes that there are many acts which, being directly injurious only to the agents themselves, ought not to be legally interdicted, but which, if done publicly, are a violation of good manners, and coming thus within the category of offences against others may rightly be prohibited. Of this kind are offences against decency, on which it is unnecessary to dwell, rather as they are only connected indirectly with our subject. To paraphrase this from the words of Mill in a modern perspective, it basically means that you can be an evil biological race realist at home, that's fine, but the moment you open your filthy mouth on Twitter or any other social media, we will strike your shit down because it goes against what we define as good manners. As you would imagine, he was critiqued as being a big hypocrite by Walter Lippmann, who himself made a different argument, a similar kind of argument I have made on Twitter with regards to free speech, which is precisely that freedom of speech is granted for those aims you either agree on or are indifferent towards, and this strikes me very similar. The most common type of approval towards certain lifestyles, behavior, and movements is being generated through phrases such as "I don't care," as long as it doesn't bother me, or "it's their choice," thereby showing indifference, de facto allowing this behavior to manifest itself, which I think is something we should spend a lot of time thinking about, because all censored material nowadays is tied directly to what people care about, merely human biology and the activity of certain groups, and it is only censored because our current public morality is the way it is, and it has nothing to do with disinformation, because if it was about disinformation, then they would censor the Illuminati crap, the G5, Pizzagate, religious cults, alternative medicine, who, by the way, are all proven to cause much more harm and are very popular on social media, but at the same time they are no big threat, so I guess they let them go. And just because it is not political, the opinions of gurus and advocates of alternative medicine are running wild, causing massive amount of casualties. Now, I am not necessarily saying we should censor these people, but it will be expected if today's censorship wasn't political.
My belief is that we can create a new healthcare model that will bring both traditional medicine and modern allopathic medicine together.
What to do with these people? I think the free market will ultimately take care of them and they would win the Darwin Award, and again, we should be indifferent to them. Now, the final intellectual giant who made a fine case for where to draw the lines for free speech is Karl Popper, arguing that freedom of speech should be applied to all people who agree to accept it and should be excluded from all people who are illiberal. Similarly, James Lindsay had recently made an argument towards censoring critical race theory, basing it on the grounds that its proponents don't believe in freedom of speech either. The rationale is, in order to ensure we have freedom of speech, let's not grant it to people who don't believe in it, with an exception that as long as their numbers are low, they should be countered using arguments and not using force. Yet when they are truly become threatening to the liberal order, then it is when it is time to strike, and I generally find this argument to be sensible and easier to apply, similar to the argument proposed by Walter Lippmann. And how this would look in practicality. For instance, consider an example of Wash, who doesn't support free speech and voluntary consent, will not apply the same rules universally to all people, because, to paraphrase Lenin, for the state and revolution, let's usurp the state to act in the interests of our group and oppress the group that is not us. Similar themes are also present in literally every single contemporary leftist philosopher writing. And it is true, extremists don't care about the rights of their enemies, they don't want to build a society based on universal rights and laws for everyone, and in fact all of them are particularistic and for the most part solely care about securing power. Now, I'm not saying that we should not be concerned about securing power as the right, in fact quite the opposite. Certainly we should be more concerned about it, and decisively more so than your average libertarian, but when you are just concerned about power, you end up as a fascist. And here are some facts for the consideration. The number of fascists is very low and mostly comprised of social rejects and the working class, while the numbers of Washites is very high, and they possess a lot of social capital and power. In any event, I have promised you to lay down a concrete foundation of freedom of speech, and all I did now was to lay down a series of hints. However, I'm not done yet. I want to get rid of a few misconceptions that I feel surround the discourse of freedom of speech. The truth is that it is culturally loaded, and its limits depend on social attitudes. For example, most people today are willing to censor an idea if it happens to hurt the feelings of people who happen to be assigned a special status. However, it was not always the case, as in the 1940s and the 1950s, freedom of speech did not apply to communists. And you may say, even to this day, look, the restriction is still in the law. But fuck the law, we're not governed by laws, we are governed by social attitudes that have shifted, and consequently the law need not apply. Earlier, freedom of speech didn't apply to non-Christians. Even earlier than that, it did not apply to different Christians. But that's just in the West. In China, the censorship model operates on the Confucius and Marxist model, where you're not allowed to threaten the stability of the current regime. In Israel, your rights end when you start to question the Jewish foundation of the country. In Belarus, when you criticize the legitimacy of Lukashenko, and in Ukraine, when you start to advocate for the interests of the Russian minority, even before the war. And in Russia, it's pretty much when you do anything, and in Arabic countries, when you discredit their symbols, and the list goes on until you suddenly realize that the Western model of censorship is not universal, but is something unique and reserved only for the West, and only for a specific period of our history. Another Western cultural loaded concept is that apparently censorship is when the government does it, and the fact that Nick Fuentes has been banned from all platforms except for his own, Gab and Telegram, doesn't seem to bother them one bit. Such a thinking has its deep roots in the Enlightenment and the American Revolution, at a time when governments regulated the press and the practice of unironic governmental appointed censors was widespread. Today, however, this is not the case, and the tyranny comes from the private hands. And I guess this logic could be applied to some extent to Russia and China, where the government actually does stuff and is very authoritarian, but in the modern West this is a useless definition that we should get rid of, because the government is no near as powerful as those corporations, and nor does it interfere into what journalists can and can't say. The tyranny and the censorship here does not come from the government, but from other private citizens and corporations who use their power and privilege to censor people they dislike, and the government is not doing anything to stop it from happening. Getter, the supposed free speech platform, didn't ban Nick Fuentes as soon as he joined their platform because of the government. No, we don't like you, you get banned. Simple as. Which brings me to my first open argument, and that is, given the government enforces environmental regulations, makes sure there is no racial, religious, or sexual discrimination in any public space, and even sticks its nose into the matters of private citizens, perhaps it is time that the government actually does something and stands up against the enemies of freedom and protect political minorities, ensure that no idea which does not advocate for actual violence is being censored. In plain terms, it means that you should be able to find the American Renaissance on any large platform. Now, obviously there should be some caveats, and perhaps platforms with under 5 million users should be able to discriminate who they want. However, when you reach a certain threshold and your platform becomes a monopoly, as is Google, Spotify, Discord, and Twitter, it needs to be regulated by the government and ensure that it obeys the laws of the country, which should include the protection against political minorities. Big business and small business are two different things, and if you don't like the government, then let's organize people's committees. Now, with regards to applying censorship, which I am not against, the aspiration should be that it needs to be applied to every political group equally and not discriminate any particular one, as it is the case today. Point number 9. The distribution of information should be determined accordingly with the Darwinian utility of a given data in a decentralized bottom-up manner. The flow of information is essentially democratized and subverted to meet the will of the oligarchy, which uses its power to manufacture bottom-up attitudes to be in line with the values of high culture. The oligarchy itself is a heterogeneous entity that constantly competes with itself on the cultural market, thereby accelerating progress. Oh, I apologize, this will only come out in 2023. Anyways, I got sidetracked. When it comes to platforms like Twitter, no account should be immediately removed, but rather prior warnings and mutes need to appear before proceeding with the removal that can only occur in the case of a clear violation of TOS. Moreover, censorship should include things reasonable people will agree on. A good example is advocating for violence, which we'll all agree on, but also let's talk about doxing, which became the reason for removing SPLC from Gab, which was a good decision as it was not politically motivated, but rather based on a concrete violation of Gab's terms and service, which is doxing people. However, censorship should never work to censor political ideas in and of themselves, and should work on case-by-case basis, and should be strictly monitored and open to the public to ensure a democratic communication between the two. That is, communism, white nationalism, trans ideology, CRT, fascism should all be given the same rights to platform themselves without any prejudice. And in the case of an account removal without an indication of a TOS violation or without a good reason, well, the user is then able to sue the company. What, you censored Stefan Molyneux? Well, here's a $100 million fine or a lawsuit that will surely put you out of business for good, and all companies would follow suit no matter their ideology because they'll be scared to death. And in order for that to happen, we need to lobby actual government laws to be put in place so that people who are right would have an audience and people who are extremists, who are violent, would not have an audience, as opposed to hoping that Daddy Dom Elon would do something instead of us doing something ourselves. And of course there are a few problems with it. Aside of the vagueness of violence, we have to ask ourselves what exactly we should do with extremists. Well, it is true that leftoids of today have learned to master censorship within the liberal system and have redefined language in a way as to render cultural laws to be obsolete. They have essentially equated discussion about racial and sexual differences and not liking certain groups to violence, thereby taking away your rights to participate and speak in a democratic arena. To make sure it doesn't happen again, laws should not be culturally loaded, but rather static and not determined by the environment, and consequently violence should be defined in the most direct way possible, as well as free speech committees should be then formed from a diverse array of people representing different political traditions who ideally should work closely with public platforms and the government in determining whether a violation of freedom has occurred or a company was in the right to censor. Finally, let's talk about the extremists who represent about 5% of the political user demographic. The thing about them is they are usually low IQ, and because low IQ correlates strongly with intolerance, they would get censored themselves due to their own stupidity, much like many BIPOCs manage to get themselves into jail more often than other demographics. Extremists would also never rise to the levels of cultural elites, as elites are usually high IQ, and high IQ people have always been tolerant and pro-free speech, and consequently they will appeal just to the marginals, never increasing their numbers in the process. If they manage to stay afloat, well, good for them, but they will never reach a large enough number of people to actually pose a threat to law and order, which brings me to argue for free speech out of indifference. Now, at the same time, I would of course be worried about them discussing making weapons and other similar activities, but this is not a matter of free speech, but rather a matter of local authorities, and such behavior I have never noticed anyways on the big platforms. However, we have a long road to make towards it, and likely will not see this come into fruition, at least in the West. Though there are very good news from the UK, but only when it comes to the academia, and it's not clear how effective it's going to be. Now, before I end this video, I want to address a really dumb argument I sometimes stumble upon on the right, the dissident right that is. And it's not that we should not use the government to give us protection. No, that's a dumb one and I have already addressed it. It's a different kind of argument, but it's nonetheless no less deranged. In fact, it is even more deranged than the previous argument. The argument usually comes from people who have a really strong sense of power relations and revenge fantasies. And it's that let's become anti-liberals ourselves. Ironically enough, it is made by people who have no social power and who are unaware of the real relations of power which dominate and shape our society, but like to fantasize how of an ubermensch they are themselves. The problem with that argument, aside from it being unrealistic and frankly most would agree is a terrible prescription, as it is made by the people who fundamentally do not care about freedom of speech and building a society of rights, but just want to reverse power relations. But this is not even the main point, which makes this argument sound so deranged. How many people are going to be on your side? 4%? 3%? 7%? And you think that 7% would go against the 93%? What will actually happen to you is that the system will point fingers at you and say that we protect ourselves and the rest of society, with their consent of course, against a fringe extremist minority like yourself who want to be tyrannical. You are a threat to democracy, they'll say, so if you want to get censored, you can go ahead. But high IQ people prefer to have high IQ solutions, and opposing free speech is not just something they think about. In fact, high IQ people want to extend the rights of free speech to evil bigots, and likely the main reason for why universities have turned intolerant and left-wing is because more and more low IQ people are being let in. But that's a story for another day.